lapel mic. Okay.
All right, so
I think
hello everyone, and welcome
That's
to the media forum laid on by the Department for Media, Culture, Communication Studies and Culture. Oh, Communications and Cultural Studies, let me get it right. This is the second last media forum of this term, and we're really going to miss it when it goes. My name is Rashmi Roshanlal, and each media forum, for those of you who don't know, addresses topical, often controversial issues, and we have a tagline that is basic but very pointed, and it is debate, dispute, discuss. This event, by the way, is being live streamed, and it is also being filmed by our MA journalism students. The launch of our colleague, senior lecturer Terry Kirby's book would anyway be a very exciting event, but the fact that it is on tabloids makes it even doubly exciting. And of course, we're going to wait for Terry to tell us more about what led him to write the book. I have just bought it. I encourage everyone to buy. There are copies available to buy outside. Terry's been there, done that, and he's got the book. So we're going to, and probably the t-shirt too. Fortunately, he's in conversation today with probably the very best person to discuss what tabloids do to journalism, to politics, to society, to culture. And that's Ian Burrell. And just a little thumbnail sketch on Ian. He is the iPaper's weekly media columnist. Consulting, I noticed it is a very long, it's not really quite a thumbnail sketch. He writes for Bloomberg and for Reuters. He started his career at the Birmingham Mail, where he was UK Regional Reporter of the Year. He's worked at ITV. He's worked on the Inside team at the Sunday Times, and for 20 years at the Independent, where he was Home Affairs Editor, Media Editor, and Assistant Editor. He is also the speech coach for the global youth leaders organization, One Young World, and he has written the life story of David Rodigan, the reggae DJ and BBC radio presenter. So just one final thing to say before I hand over to Terry and to Ian. After the conversations and the Q&A, please do join us outside for a cheese straw and a glass of wine or something, and we can continue the conversation outside. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rima. We're using this handheld mic. Are these working? Can you hear me all right? Oh, great. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. It's great to see you all. Terry,
Yeah.
A History of Tabloid Journalism, your splendid tome here. It covers 400 years of publishing history. So what prompted you to produce this book now? Why is it relevant to today?
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for coming tonight. And it's great to be talking to an old colleague who I worked with for many years, one of the most diligent reporters, best reporters I've ever met. Why did I write this book? Well, I was asked to do it, and my initial reaction was, no, that's a stupid idea. I'm going to kind of waste 4 or 5 years of my life doing it. And then I kind of thought about it, and I looked around, and I realized that although there have been quite a few books about the tabloids and the origins of tabloids and the popular media, they fell into 2 categories. One was the rather dry academic tomes of some of my colleagues or other academics, which looked at things from very much from a purely political perspective or economic perspective, and had, how should we put it, rather boring covers. I'm glad to say that thanks to Reaction Books, my cover is actually really rather good one. Someone actually said it was the best book cover they've seen this year. I looked around, and the other sort of books were like kind of anecdotal stuff. You know, how I got my greatest scoops and the kind of, you know, the ins and outs of sort of, you know, japes of Fleet Street and the great pubs and things like that. So it was all rather kind of anecdotal, celebratory stuff. And there's been no actual attempt at writing a history of tabloid newspapers, or from the, you know, we blur the lines a bit, to the popular press at all. So I thought, well, why not? I'll knock it off in a kind of maybe a year or so. And it was a labour of love that eventually took me 5 years, because things like the pandemic got in the way, and actually having to come teach here and actually teach brilliant students also kind of got in the way. But I got there in the end, and here it is, and I'm very proud of it. It taught me an awful lot about journalism, and it taught me an awful lot about the struggles of trying to find out information in the middle of a pandemic. But it's here, and I think it serves a purpose, which is to bring together a lot of things about newspapers and the popular press and media generally. And I began to also realise quite, you know, the extent to which the tabloid media, the popular media, influenced our culture. I mean, I kind of knew that anyway, but it really, really came home to me. And also the fact that over, you know, in the last 15 years, there has been a massive re-examination of the tabloid media and the popular media with the Leveson inquiry, and then subsequently with the way in which the digital world has changed the media completely, changed popular press. And so I felt that all of that really needed documenting, and someone had to do it.
Great. Now, when we say tabloid, a lot of us think, probably a lot of people in this audience think that it's a modern term. It's part of modern life. Now, after your 5 years labour of love digging into the history of all of this, you're suggesting something different in this book. Could you explain to us the roots of this concept?
Well, funny enough, I've been working on the book for about 3 years, and we were having drinks with some friends, teachers, and one of them said to me, so where does the word tabloid come from? And I said, and I flannelled, and I said, I'll find out, and I did. And actually, tabloid was a kind of late Victorian word that came from a mixture of tablet and alkaloid, and it came to mean something small and concentrated. And that's where the word was in kind of popular-ish use back at the, in the 1890s and so forth. And Alfred Harmsworth, who was the founder of the first great press baron, who was the founder of the Daily Mail, of the Daily Mirror, who once owned the Times and various other newspapers. He was the complete definition of a kind of prodigy. He was a genius, and made huge amounts of money before he was even 30. And he was the man who coined the word. He was asked by a man called Joseph Pulitzer, who some of you may have heard of, who founded the Pulitzer Prize for Excellence in Journalism, which is an American institution. And Pulitzer was involved in what later became known as the Yellow Journalism Wars of New York in the 1890s. And Pulitzer asked Harmsworth, this sort of genius for London, to edit the first edition of the New York World for the first edition of the century in January the 1st, 1901. And Harmsworth, who'd always favoured a kind of more concentrated journalism, said in a statement on the front page of that edition that he guest edited, here is my version of tabloid, is my tabloid newspaper. It's a concentrated version of today's news. And that's really where it came from, although it didn't really become into much popular use until much, much later, really kind of post-war.
So that word tabloid, Terry, it's often synonymous with negative media values, and we hear tabloid and we think sensational, salacious, gossipy, and I'm sure we're going to get into some of those nasties as we talk. But can tabloids also be a force for good?
Tabloids can be an incredible force for good. Unfortunately, the force for bad has often outweighed the force for good, and a lot of it has become lost in history. But if you look back at, say, the Daily Mirror, when it was at its sort of post-war height, under the genius that was Hugh Cudlip, he had one flaw, and I'll come to that in a minute. Hugh Cudlip, later Lord Cudlip, was basically the man behind the growth of the Daily Mirror, with an incredible kind of cast of journalists that he had at his disposal. And they were incredibly good at promoting they were the paper of the Labour movement in the post-war era. They covered social issues, social policy, all the way through, and they were generally a force for good. In the pre-war years, the Daily Mirror was also a very strident voice on behalf of what was then the kind of new working class movement, the Labour Party. So much so that when Hitler was drawing up plans to invade London, the executives and editors of the Daily Mirror were kind of on the list for people to be seized immediately, and what would have happened to them. And the Daily Mirror was an incredible influential force. It was the tabloid paper I grew up on as the sort of thinking person's tabloid. Cudlip did one thing which perhaps stained his reputation, because he owned, because of the way newspaper deals worked, he owned a newspaper called the Daily Herald, and he sold it to a bloke called Rupert Murdoch, who by that time had owned the News of the World and was desperate to get the daily paper on his books to use up the spare press time from printing the News of the World every week. And he basically sold the Herald to Murdoch for a pittance, and it was called The Sun by that time, and we all know what happened next.
Well, you've mentioned the M word there, Murdoch.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of the people in the room, tabloid in a UK context will mean the likes of The Sun and the Daily Mail. I wonder if you can tell us what your feeling is after this 5 years of digging into this subject, of the influence of the tabloid proprietors, particularly those owning those titles, Rupert Murdoch, Rothermere at the Daily Mail. What influence do they really have? And you talked about this history of tabloids from the past century. How would you say the likes of Rupert Murdoch and Lord Rothermere compare in their influence to those media magnates that came before, like Northcliffe and Beaverbrook?
Well, the interesting thing is that not a lot has changed. Northcliffe and Beaverbrook, who founded and or ran the Daily Express, were fighting tooth and nail in the kind of pre-Second World War period, and they owned large numbers of newspapers between them. They were going at it hammer and tongs. All they wanted was actual power as opposed to proprietorial power. Both Northcliffe and Beaverbrook became ministers in various governments at various points, and Beaverbrook made it perfectly clear that he was not really interested in newspapers. He just wanted the power that came within newspapers. The Harmsworth, later Lord Northcliffe, was a kind of slightly different being. He loved newspapers. All he wanted to do was to make newspapers. And when he was suffering from severe mental problems, when he was confined to a room on the floor of a mansion house on the roof of a mansion house in London, and very, very seriously ill and suffering from a brain condition, he rang up the Times news desk, and they said, they say I'm ill, they won't let me out, send your best man to cover the story. And that to me was a newspaper man through and through. But they did have influence. They did influence. Wanted to kind of run things. The influence of Beaverbrook and Northcliffe was such that in one political situation they were condemned by an MP as saying they have the prerogative of the harlot, which is a quote that came from Rudyard Kipling, which is power without responsibility. And that, in fact, was the title of my colleague here, James Curran's book about the media. And I think it's very true, and I think the idea of power without responsibility still carries on. Murdoch wanted and has wanted power in different ways. He wants economic power. He wants his newspapers to be widely successful. He's not particularly interested in political power. He would never have served in a government, I suspect, but he was very, very clear that what he wanted was economic power, in the sense that he told Tony Blair, when he was saying that he wanted Tony Blair to, he was considering supporting Tony Blair in the ahead of the 1997 election, that because he thought the Tories were a load of rubbish, but what he wanted from Blair was a condition that he wouldn't join the exchange rate mechanism, and Blair never did. So what Murdoch has always wanted was that kind of entry to the kind of the political world. He wanted to be kind of courted by political leaders. He's always wanted that kind of power, but it was always kind of power through the back door, as it were. He didn't necessarily want it to be seen shaking hands with Blair and in fact with all of David Cameron and all the subsequent prime ministers, but he liked to know that his influence was there. And that's been Murdoch's way all along, and it's still there. Rothermere is very different, a tax exile, again, influential through his acolytes and through his newspapers. There was a famous quote from Paul Dacre, for many years editor of the Daily Mail, when Blair was winning the 1997 election by kind of winning over the middle classes. And Dacre strode around the newsroom saying, "What the hell is happening? These are our people." Seeing that they were, the middle classes were deserting the Tories for Labour. So there's that sense of the Daily Mail of ownership of their readers. And I certainly think that Daily Mail knows their readers as well as Taylor Swift knows her audience. Yeah.
So interesting what you say about past media proprietors having a direct role in government, having a place in the cabinet. A relevance today, we think of America now with Elon Musk being an advisor to Trump, the proprietor of such an influential social platform as X. We, of course, have Evgeny Lebedev, Lord Lebedev in the House of Lords. Be interesting if a Rothermere or a member of the Murdoch family, I think they'd have to be a British citizen first to ever have a place in British politics. What do you think these owners are trying to do when, in terms of the editorial policies of their paper? What are they trying to get out of it? And how much do you think they interfere with those editorial decisions? Because we often hear from Murdoch editors that they're free to do what they want, and they don't get the call from Rupert. Can we believe that? Is that even credible?
I've heard that, but it is well known that no one needs to get the call from Murdoch. No one needs the call. They know what he thinks.
Guessing his bidding.
I'm not sure whether he does now, but he certainly used to turn up at editorial conferences, sit in the corner, and the one thing that Murdoch deployed magnificently was silence. And people fell into it, and they just expressed the opinions that he expected to hear, that they assumed that he felt. And it was... so there's never been much direction. It was always what they knew the boss wanted. Certainly that was true of people like Rebecca Brooks, who was has become his number two in the UK for many years. It was always that kind of, we know what he wants, we know what his views are, and they were kind of sympathetico, as it were. I mean, I think with Rothermere is a different thing. Rothermere is, you know, the Daily Mail is an incredibly well-run company, as is actually, you know, News UK. I mean, they're both, you know, remarkably stable companies. With the Daily Mail, which is still run by Northcliffe's family, as it were. His brother took over the paper after Rothermere's death, and after Harmsworth's death, his brother Rothermere, and ran and it's his great grandchildren the grandson that runs the paper today, and all the Daily Mail interest, and you know, by extension, the largest website in the Western world, Mail Online. So, what was the question?
Well, I was asking, do they interfere?
Yeah, does Rothermere? I don't think Rothermere
decisions?
interferes, but in picking someone like Paul Dacre to run the paper, they know what the corporate view of the paper is. They know how the Daily Mail works. They know what Mail Online is supposed to do. They know by instinct, by understanding. They know what the traditions are so closely embedded into those newspapers. They don't have to think twice about it, really, I don't think.
And how great is that influence? Are we at risk of overstating it? Did they really have the balance of power in elections? Was it really the Sun that won it in 1992 when they turned Neil Kinnock, the Labour leader, who was expecting to win, into a light bulb and said, would the last person out of Britain turn the light out, and then claimed it was the Sun what won it when the Tories won the election. Is that right? And how about their influence over elections now up until this year?
Very different, I think. I think certainly in those elections in '92, the Sun could definitely claim that they won it, because the Sun's circulation, I can't remember exactly, but in those years was massive. It was read by, a quarter of the population, something like 4 million, yeah. So you multiply that 4 times, that's kind of 16, 20 million readers every day. And the influence goes beyond that. And it's quite extraordinary influence on the political discourse. And you have to remember, for those of you born more recently, this was a much smaller media landscape. The Sun could dominate that media landscape. There wasn't the variety of competing sources of information that there is out there in the digital sphere these days. It's all out there, and it's all very confusing, and there's all just lots of information, and you kind of pick your way through it to find out whether you're on Facebook or TikTok, or your favourite read is something like The Critic or Unheard. You pick your way through it these days. Back in the 1990s, in the dark ages, that was all there was on the newsstands, and that would then influence. That was what was on the BBC or ITV, and they would follow it up. So it was a much simpler media landscape, and the voice was louder of the Sun, and yes, they influenced it. Today, I think the influence is different. On paper circulations are absolutely nothing compared to what they once were, but the impact out there in the digital sphere, I think, is still there. But it kind of permeates through the digital sphere in a completely different way, and it influences conversations, it influences discourse, it influences all the retweets and reposting and all of that kind of just, it's that. So it's not quite so direct, but it's absolutely true. As we talked earlier in this year, that ahead of the July election, Starmer was just desperate not to offend the right-wing newspapers, the Mail and the Sun particularly, because they have such significant voices. And so there was so much that was just just carefully skirting around things, being very careful about what they did ahead of that election, so they didn't annoy the tabloids. And it's significant that the Sun left it until, like, literally, I think, the day before the election, before they gave Starmer a kind of reluctant thumbs up. Whereas when Blair was endorsed by the Sun in '97, I think it was a couple of 3 weeks before the election. So it had much more time to permeate through the kind of through the public discourse.
And what we saw there was that enduring power of the format, that tabloid front page, which still today could be held up by a news reader on television and have impact, and then can be disseminated across social media. And news influencers, conservative in this case, news influencers would have rallied behind that. And so even in a time when a lot of young people never even look at a tabloid newspaper, let alone consider buying one, you still had that power hanging over the campaign, and this fear, Keir Starmer being criticised for having a lack of policies during the campaign. He was fearful of making a misstep that the Daily Mail or the Sun might jump on.
Yeah, exactly. And when he was asked whether he was going to enact Leveson 2, which we can talk about in a minute, I mean, he just, backed away from it, didn't give a firm answer, whereas, most of the Labour movement would say, well, you should have a look at Leveson 2. A lot of people, such as my good friend Mr. Cathcart here, would argue that it should be enacted. But Starmer was very careful about that. He hasn't, as I understand it, unless one can correct me, actually definitely ruled it out yet. But it probably isn't going to happen.
No, it's obviously not a priority, and it's one that he's carefully stepping around. But before we get to Leveson 2, we should talk about what led to Leveson 2, which was the phone hacking scandal that led to the closure of the News of the World in 2011. How much was that the result of an embedded tabloid culture that led to this extraordinary scandal, and what impact has that had?
Colossal, really. I think what was amazing about the tabloid, the hacking scandal that emerged through the work of Nick Davis of The Guardian, largely, who basically did what a proper journalist should do, was uncover some stories. And Davis exposed the fact that the News of the World was paying huge amounts of money in out-of-court legal settlements to a number of people who had their telephones and other things hacked and intercepted and so forth. What was astonishing, again, when I began to research the kind of sequence of events for the book, was the fact that a lot of this had been happening in plain sight for several years. And what was remarkable is that both society and journalists had not really picked up on it. And there'd been this sort of increasing concern in the 1980s about tabloid behaviour, about long lens photography, stalking celebrities, treading in people's gardens to put photographs of their back windows, all the activities of the paparazzi around the death of Princess Diana and others. And so there was widespread concern about activities that always kind of get sort of promises of good behaviour amongst the proprietors. Rothermere the current Rothermere's father, in the aftermath of the Diana death, promised that they would never ever use paparazzi pictures again without his permission. And of course that was a promise more honoured in the breach than the observance in later years, when the Daily Mail and Mail Online very happy to use any old paparazzi picture. Except the difference is now, of course, all the celebrities provide all those pictures. The News of the World and other red tops, competed with each other for stories, and there was a general progression of bad behaviour. There was a hacking case that was dismissed as the one rogue reporter, as they called it. There were other instances of intrusion. There was a kind of sort of slippery slope downwards of kind of almost criminal type behaviour amongst the tabloids, competing with each other in this ferocious market for readers, and that is what led to it. But what was surprising that it wasn't spotted beforehand, and then when the scandal broke, it became quite clear that hundreds of people came forward with hacking allegations that their telephones or other parts of their private life have been intercepted and investigated by the tabloids, principally the Sun, principally the News of the World, but then also the Sunday Mirror and the Mirror Group newspapers became highly complicit in it. And there's been a series, which I document in the book, series of court judgments since through civil courts, which have named literally dozens of employees as being complicit in hacking and other similar related activities.
Yeah, now I well remember covering the publication of Lord Leveson's report after his long inquiry into the behaviour of the press, and that was 12 years ago to this month, November 2012. Yeah. 2,000 pages published at the QE Centre in Westminster, and still part 2 of the inquiry, which was supposed to look at corruption between the press and the police, has never happened. We've got ongoing court cases involving Prince Harry, primarily, also Lord Watson, Tom Watson. A sense there certainly from the Prince that there's unfinished business. This is regarding his court action against the Sun. Do you feel that there's more to this, that we need to hear part 2 of Leveson explore the relationship between the police and the press? We had Operation Elvedon. A lot of journalists were arrested. That was subsequently a heavily criticised investigation because many of those journalists were acquitted. It was a 5-year investigation, I think. It cost a lot of money. Do you feel that there are still unanswered questions? There are other aspects beyond those that were looked at in terms of Operation Elvedon, looking into payments to public officials. There are other aspects towards corrupt relationships between press and the police. What needs to happen?
Well, on one hand, I think that it would become a massive issue. It would become a massive upheaval. Do the newspapers need another upheaval such as that? I do actually think, and you might argue that Elvedon and the other related inquiries, of which there were quite a few, would covered it all. I would be guided by Lord Leveson himself, who, when it was told that the previous Tory government was not minded to pursue Leveson Part 2, which was always designed as an investigation and inquiry into the links at the higher levels between newspaper proprietors, between politicians and the police. In other words, tackling the people that were, how shall we say, complacent about some of this, that was always the marker for Leveson too. And it was always designed to come after any court cases that arose, and after the first part of the inquiry. But the Tory government wrote to Lord Leveson, Tory ministers, and said, we we're minded not to go ahead with it. We think there's been enough uncovered. The world has moved on. Everything has changed. We're now in a digital sphere. There's other regulatory machinery coming in. Let's not bother with it. And Leveson wrote back to them, and I'm amazed that it didn't get more coverage at the time, and I uncovered the letter. I found the letters. Absolutely incendiary at the idea that the inquiry should not resume as part 2, because he said so much had emerged after his inquiry that it needed proper explanation. For instance, there was the story about what was the man who was popularly known as the fake sheikh, who was the Mazar Mahmood, who was a reporter on the News of the World, who famously dressed up as a sort of a Middle Eastern sheikh type, and he was involved in literally dozens of cases where the police were called in, and he acted as a sort of agent provocateur in lots of cases, exposing criminality, conspiracies, and so forth. And although it's quite clear that some of this was entirely justified, there were many other instances that came to light where it seemed like he'd simply been, he'd simply encouraged people to commit crimes. He'd acted as an agent provocateur to bring people into kind of committing crimes in various ways. And Leveson cited this. I mean, he was eventually convicted of entrapment, I think it was. And Leveson cited this as something which had not been explored in the Leveson, in the original inquiry, which should be properly explored. And certainly a lot of the things that have come out subsequently in the Prince Harry court cases does merit explanation. The links between News International and News International executives and members of the Metropolitan Police never fully explained. Neil Wallace, who was senior officer of the Metropolitan, senior executive at the News of the World, very close links with the police, became a police media advisor. Rebecca Brooks was knew the police socially, was very, very active she was an incredible networker. Various senior police officers went to write for the News of the World. So the links there were quite extraordinary. The links with David Cameron when they were having what was famously disclosed in Leveson as their country suppers together out in the cosy Cotswolds, were all it needed further examination.
Right. Now, what has been the damage done by all of this very public airing of the tabloids and the newspaper industry more widely, dirty laundry? I think most people in the journalism industry would accept that the tabloids have been in a period of decline in those 12 years since Leveson. To what degree is that the result of the public and the readers turning away from them after what they've heard, and to what degree is it all about the impact of the internet and changing media consumption habits?
I think it's all down to Kim Kardashian, because the whole culture, Leveson was a kind of break point, really, a kind of, because everything happened since then. You have to think that in Leveson, to some of us old enough, we think of that as only just a few years ago, but it was only then that the smartphone was coming into being. Social media was still in its infancy compared to what it is now. The 5G type technology was very much in the future. So in the space since Leveson completed in 2012, the whole world has changed. Newspaper print circulations have declined to the point where they're so low they won't even tell the official monitors exactly how many they do sell. Was it the Audit Bureau of Circulation? They won't tell them how much they sell. But the digital reach out there is enormous, although to reach, to coin the phrase, own so many websites that all look the same. It's very difficult these days to discern what's the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, the Daily Mirror, or a provincial newspaper. But provincial weekly newspapers are now carrying content that's just been churned out nationally with no relevance to their local areas. It's quite under the Reach umbrella. It's quite extraordinary. The rise of social media, I mean, the tabloids were in a position where they didn't need to employ, and post-everything, didn't need to employ the dark arts quite so much, because all that kind of lust for content was all supplied by the Kim Kardashians of this world, putting all their baby showers and weddings and parties and celebrity this, that, and the other, all on Instagram and Facebook and other parts of social media. The tabloids have all just hoovered all that up. They don't need to kind of pay the paparazzi still do exist, but they don't need to kind of to employ them to anything like the same extent. And it's all there being hoovered up and churned out in huge amounts online. So their influence is still very much there, but as I was saying earlier, it's much more diffuse, it's much more spread out through the whole ecosphere, and they still have an influence. What will be interesting will be to see which one of the red tops becomes completely online. I mean, interestingly enough, our former employer, The Independent, was the first big newspaper to go completely online. And it was thought at that point that it wouldn't be long before a red top went the same way. I suspect they will keep the brands going for a little while longer, but I can't see much future for for instance, for the Daily Star. Which we haven't talked about, and I was hoping you would ask me about Martians and the Daily Star. Because the Daily Star is still producing headlines about Martians stole my baby. I was abducted by aliens, which were the National Enquirer were running 20 years ago, and which 300 years ago were appearing in the popular news sheets that were the origins of the tabloids. Strange. One of the things in my book is about the strange news pamphlets of the sort of 16th century, which had things like, you know, not quite. They didn't use the word aliens, but you know, there were strange, bizarre happenings out there in the world which we could not explain. So that's a great tradition of the tabloid newspaper, but I don't think the Daily Star will last much longer.
But it's interesting, you mentioned the Daily Star. A lot of people in journalism are quite praiseworthy of the Daily Star because it has a wit to some of its front pages, which is reminiscent of the Sun in its heyday. And many people think now that the Sun has lost some of that humour, some of what people bought it for when its circulation was at its height, its cleverness, its kind of tabloid sensibility in actually being able to amuse people with a smart front page. And the Star is probably the best example of that on the newsstand these days, but obviously
I'd agree
it
with
doesn't
that. I think
have the same clout.
I think that's very true. I mean, the front pages have a kind of wit and invention, which is definitely missing elsewhere.
And that was an essential part of the tabloid mix, of what the tabloid was.
It's always been part of the tabloid mix, which was always about the fun as well as the serious bits. And in fact, you know, that was very much from the start the tabloid ethos. If you look back over the origins of the tabloids, it was so much of it was about entertainment. And with a kind of, you know, with a witty commentary idea, long before it actually became physically tabloid as opposed to the cultural idea of tabloid. A lot of that wit was out there originally, but no, it has gone. I mean, the Sun, all the newspapers now are much, in terms of their printed versions, they're much more, they're much quieter, they're much more nervous, really, of doing anything too much, unless on other sides. But yes, there's a lot of enjoyment to be had from the Daily Star front pages.
And you speak to people in tabloid newsrooms today, and they'll talk about how quiet it is, how there's no shouting, there's no abuse from the news desk or calling out if you've missed a story in the way that traditionally was the case, which is a good thing from an HR point of view. But a lot of the older tabloid journalists do notice the difference. And there's a loss of energy in some of the newsrooms, which might be symbolic of, I think, of a lack of confidence compared to how things once were. There's a realization that the influence isn't the same as it once was.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, that what you've seen is the end of the strong men, and they're all men, unfortunately. Although Dawn Newsom at the Daily Star is the only woman there with the only fun thing, but it's the end of the strong men and women, and the rise of the journeyman and woman. I think more prosaic people. I mean, people like Kelvin Mackenzie, who was the editor of The Sun. You were kind of repelled by his political views, but he really knew. Well, I was personally, but he knew how to run a newspaper, even if it did involve, shouting at people and bullying and all the rest of it. And his creed was shock and amaze me on every page. And certainly The Sun at its height did that with the most extraordinary advertising campaigns on television when they first started. It was, and the level of sex and sexuality that were in those original promotions for The Sun. It's French Knickers Week in The Sun, and it'll be all over the television adverts on a Sunday night, and it was, it was voiced by an actor called Christopher Timothy, who went on to become a famous television vet, and it was, but that kind of gusto, that kind of, whether you liked it or not, people lapped it up and went to.
And none of these editors today have much profile. They all keep a low. They keep their heads down, even in a time when journalists generally are encouraged to be the brand, to be out there, to be very public-facing. We don't tend to see newspaper editors much on Question Time or even out there as commentators.
I ought to know the name of the editor of The Sun, but I can't actually think
Victoria Newton.
Oh, it's Victoria Newton, isn't it?
Yeah. And you mentioned the Cudlip era Mirror and how much power and mass appeal that had. And we talk about editors. Well, Reach, which is the biggest publisher in this country, has just had a clear out of all its senior editorial staff, including Lloyd Embley, who's the editor-in-chief across the Mirror titles, and Alison Phillips, who was perhaps one of the better-known editors. She was the editor of the Daily Mirror. They've all left. The Express editors have also been moved out, and they've moved up somebody from the online team to take over, seeing the future in the digital space. And this is a publisher which has made something like 800 journalists redundant over the last year or so. So what we're seeing, what you've told us about here, you've talked about the period where the tabloid newspapers had incredible appeal, mass circulation, political influence, making huge amounts of money for their owners. We're starting to see elements of decline, and yet they still have an enduring power as well, which permeates through the various media platforms that we engage with these days. So maybe we can attempt to address the question of this session, which is, are we all living on planet tabloid today?
I think we are. We may not realise it, but we are. We're influenced. That influence of tabloids and on popular culture, I think, there was always this belief that the Sun, particularly, and the Daily Star in its early days had coarsened had coarsened popular culture, had degraded popular culture, and I think that's true, because I think, you know, the level at which we care about these things is, you know, the bar is slightly dropped, and I think that high culture doesn't quite get its look in anymore. Radio 4 just cancelled its program on its program about books called Open Book. So there's not much serious discussion about the latest novels there, and every Radio 4 program about science or anything serious seems to almost always have to have a comedian somewhere on the presenting team. And we see how the tabloid culture just affects a lot of television, a lot of the kind of what you might call the more popular end of television. We see how the relationship between something like I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here dominates television schedules, dominates that end of the television spectrum, and of course Love Island, massively promoted through the tabloids, again occupies huge hours of television time, and that all began with reality television. And reality television has gone from being a kind of novelty to becoming so much of the kind of dominant factor of television scheduling, because it's cheap and cheerful, and we all love Strictly Come Dancing, but well, some of us do, but it has become a kind of, you know, the way in which that permeates through the system, the way in which it kind of trickles through social media, and the two things feed off each other. It's you know, it's all part of us now. It used to be. What's interesting is that the kind of interaction between reality television and tabloids has sort of replaced the interaction between reality television and the soaps, because it used to be that, you know, every storyline on EastEnders or Coronation Street was kind of replicated in some way in the tabloids, but they don't lend themselves in the same way to social media interaction, in the same way that, you know, all the people promoting and appearing on Love Island and in Bake Off and I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. There's so much more material there for the tabloids to use, and they use on their websites, and they use in the printed versions. And I do think that we're all we just know that is the way we live in the world now, and that's what we accept. I mean, there's a lot to be said for it. Who wants high culture all the while? You know, I mean, there's nothing wrong with popular culture, but I think some of it has some of our sense of what we ought to be doing has been eroded, I think.
It's
you
very
don't ask me what
interesting.
we ought to be doing.
There's that symbiosis that you identify between the tabloids as they are now, which is a digital-first operation, and the conventional television channels, which are again threatened by the changing media landscape. And the online versions of The Sun, The Mail, The Mirror, they depend very heavily on those reality programs, and they work together, they support each other, and so much traffic is driven by that content.
Yeah.
And the online versions of those tabloids are very different from those print versions as they were before. The content that they carry is markedly different. Mail Online before the election was quite neutral in the way it addressed the election campaign by comparison with the Daily Mail newspaper. That they were leading on non-political stories until quite close to the election because it was comparatively boring, I think, for their readers compared to some of the other things that were happening. And yet, you know, these tabloid entities in their digital formats continue to command audiences of 26 million people in this country a month. Both the Sun and the Mail, they're almost level pegging in that. Hugely well-read still, and to the degree that in this country we haven't really seen digital native news providers emerge as one might have expected, as we've seen in the US, for example. We don't really have that. And the tabloid brands are still sitting in that space, in that popular news space, digitally as well. And they're taking advantage of being English language outlets to expand in the United States as well, particularly the Mail, although they're having difficulties there because the social channels are reluctant to share their content to the extent that they would like, and they've had traffic fall off, and some of them have had to lay people off as a result of that. But they're still dominant, and they've been effective in blocking off challenger brands coming through into the digital news space. So yeah, that still permeates. I would probably take a slightly different view of this, are we living on Planet Tabloid? Because in my view, the impact of the internet on our media landscape has been so profound and fundamental that I think to see it still in terms of a format which was a 20th century physical format, which was that all-powerful tabloid front page which would frighten politicians over their breakfast and bully politicians in some circumstances. I don't think we've continued that. I think we're in a different era now. I think it's really something different, although they continue to have that influence, they continue to set the agenda, and with, you know, another declining medium, which is linear television, together they still set the news agenda, which news influencers who are increasingly taking over from mainstream media in impacting on the way that young people think about news and politics, still take some of their lead from the topics which the tabloids have identified and pushed. And also, I would say that the impact of the tabloids in shaping Planet Tabloid, as you refer to it, has been that they were prescient, they were ahead of their time in seeing the decline in attention span and the need to grab attention, the need to convey information very quickly in few words or in a compelling image, and that has preceded our scrolling, short attention span media consumption of today. So I think some of those skills would be transferable, and the people who maybe in years gone by would have been putting together a gripping tabloid front page are now producing the memes that go viral on socials. Yeah. Those instinctive skills for writing a headline would be transferable to producing that kind of content online, or even to producing a TikTok which tells a story in an amusing way in maybe 90 seconds. So those values are still there. But I think to say that we're still in awe of and somehow led by the tabloids, I think we might be giving them too much power.
I agree with that. I agree
that.
with that. I don't think they have anything like the kind of power amongst the populace, or they're not. It's not perceived in the same way. In that sense of where, you know, in the days of that Kinnock time when the Sun was the only newspaper in any house, and it was the only means, it was the only window onto the world for these people, for a certain, you know, for the Sun readers, that and, you know, EastEnders. That was the only way in which they found out about what was going on in the world. But I think you're absolutely right, and it's a very good point, that the kind of short, snappy attention span stuff, which you know, was exactly what Harmsworth envisaged when he created that front page of the New York World in 1901. You know, he ordered everyone not to write anything longer than about 400 words, and that it all should be sort of fitted on a small grid. And that was that idea that we all had shorter attention span. And we don't really appreciate now how radical that was at the time, because, you know, in the Victorian era, the then broadsheets of the Times and the Telegraph and other newspapers had incredibly long screeds of reports on political affairs, and long parliamentary reports, and long court reports, and long kind of literary style essays. And the idea of shorter, snappier stories, which was the one thing that Harmsworth introduced throughout his newspapers, was such a kind of, you know, it was like the introduction of colour television. It on black and white, it changed everything, and that's what's led us to where we are today. And the other thing we've not really touched on is the influence of that tabloid agenda and that mindset on the existing serious papers, such as the Telegraph and the Times. And there is this, you know, again, another symbiosis, that they're following very much kind of similar agendas these days, you know, particularly with the Telegraph waging cultural wars all the while on its reporting. And they're much more, whereas perhaps in the early years they would have, you know, when the tabloids, you know, was in the 50s and 60s, they would be a bit dismissive of tabloid stories. I know when we started on The Independent, it was always like, you know, no, we're not going to bother with that. We're a bit above all that kind of stuff. Now the tabloids are much more influential on the broadsheets than they ever were. Although it was always significant that the Times would always pick up on obsessions of the Sun, as it were, or a story Sun was producing. The Times would sort of have a go at that story at some point, wouldn't they? And now the Telegraph has gone very much along those lines.
And within the industry, it's very interesting, the influence of the Daily Mail, which is, and some people in the audience might be surprised at how revered it is within journalistic circles. It has been over a long period of time for the way that it invests in journalism and the sort of training that it gives to some of its younger journalists. So I used to be quite surprised when I was younger to see there's so many Guardian journalists who'd actually worked on the Daily Mail before, because you'd think, how could you work at somewhere that was so ideologically different and then make that switch? But it was fairly common. And even to this day, if you look across what was Fleet Street, the national newspaper titles, there are former Daily Mail executives editing the Telegraph, Chris Evans, as you mentioned, and that's pursuing a very strong culture wars agenda in its home news coverage, I would say. The Sunday Times editor, again, is former Daily Mail. So is the Times editor, Tony Gallagher. And indeed, the Independent editor, actually, Geordie Gregg, although he's perhaps cut from slightly different cloth to some of the others, he is actually a former Daily Mail editor as well.
He was Daily Mail.
Yeah.
Not quite cut from the same cloth,
yeah.
I'd argue, having worked with him.
Yeah. But, yeah.
Okay.
we're going to have some questions, and we've been
I
talking
think
for a
it's
long
ti-
time.
Yeah, we've talked enough. We're going hoarse. We have some questions. Christian, I know the people here, so
You've got a mic. You've got a microphone.
Can everybody asking questions explain who they are, please?
Christian Allmark, formerly of The Independent. I think you're a little bit optimistic about the future of newspapers. I was trying to buy a newspaper the other day somewhere where I wasn't using it, and it was virtually impossible to find somewhere to buy a newspaper, right? And so won't the whole caboodle collapse when they stop delivering them? I mean, my local shop where I live used to stock all the newspapers. It now just stocks the ones that people order, and in a year or two they won't bother anymore. So won't the whole thing collapse in one go, including the tabloids?
Good question. It might suddenly happen. You know, institutions do collapse suddenly, quite quickly, like the banks did in 2009 and 8. It could suddenly happen. One does it, and everyone else thinks, yeah, we might as well go the same way. But a whole economy, as you say, news agents and all that, much less dependent upon newspapers than they used to be. But it could. It wouldn't surprise me. The idea of deliveries, yeah. I mean, who gets their newspaper delivered anymore?
My mum does.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll be so dramatic as that, Christian, personally. I think the Daily Mail still sells about 700,000 physical copies, which is an awful lot, and it's worth an awful lot of money. And I've quoted this before, but I spoke to Bill Gates a long time ago and asked him when he thought newspapers would disappear, and he suggested it would be 2050. And yeah, you might laugh, but I think it's possible that that's not a bad shout. And that's obviously somebody who
25.
was really looking to the digital future at that point. It was a long time ago, 2006. We were just, Microsoft, were just exploring the tablet as a concept. I think it was pre the iPad. And so he was looking at what was going to replace papers, but he thought they'd be around in some way until then. You have to look at some of the titles and think they could go any time now. I think you look at the Sunday People, which, for reasons known only to its publisher, doesn't really have an online presence.
No.
And last I looked, it was barely selling 50,000 copies. So I don't know how viable that's going to be for much longer. So I think it will be more of a domino effect. I think the Mirror's down to 200,000, roundabout. We talked about the Sun. Brian mentioned, I think, the Sun selling 4 million not so long ago. So you can see how serious the decline is. But I think the Mail, being the organisation that it is, will find a way to get those copies to the people that still want them. They're being quite innovative. They're now starting to charge for Mail Plus. I think they've got 100,000 subscribers for that, which is a digital version of the newspaper.
They'll find ways of doing it. They'll find ways of getting it delivered. And they'll find other ways so it becomes a more diffuse product. I mean, it was the way when Simon Callan came up with the idea of a tabloid version of The Independent, his idea was that he said, well, on supermarket shelves you get rice in different packets. It doesn't always have to be in the same format.
Strictly speaking, the Times is a tabloid, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So everything's a bit different. Brian.
I mean, just on that point very briefly.
Can you introduce yourself, Brian?
Sorry, I'm Brian Cathcart. I used to teach journalism at Kingston University. I ran Hacked office. Just on that point, and then I have a question. On that point, I did years ago a calculation looking at the 10-year trend in newspaper circulations when they still published them. and projecting it forward, looking for the point where they reach zero, basically.
Yeah.
But kind of, you know, you establish when they reach zero, and then you work back from that. And as I recall, the Mail on the trends in 2018 or thereabouts was going to hit zero in 2037. But the Mirror and the Sun were going to hit zero in 2028, something like that. And if you looked at the, you know, the viability of it all, I mean, when the Independent dumped print, it dumped lorries, deliveries, relationships with news agents, picking up the returns, which everybody forgets.
The whole ecosystem.
The whole system, which was huge and terribly expensive, and it, you know, the bottom line was huge, a huge impact on the kind of viability of the company.
Yeah.
And I bet the accountants in all the papers are looking at it and thinking exactly the same.
Well, I mean, you know, it's only in a way repeating the same process that began with the dumping of the actual printers, in-house printing and so forth. You know, that a whole number of people, you know, lost their jobs and things moved on. You know.
And the other factor is the changes digitally. We don't know what's coming down the line. There will be people who would swear that they'd always take a printed paper, who may be like 60 or 70 now, but something might happen which changes the game for them, even at their late stage, you know, and they stop taking it.
Still buy vinyl, I bet but my question is a little bit more forward-looking, and it is, I mean, I haven't been in the newsroom for a very long time. What kind of proportion of the people working in newsrooms now are working not so much on generating stories as on pushing stories electronically, on the ways of getting them on social media, on that kind of, are there large numbers of people in these newsrooms doing that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, SEO and following trends is you know,
Just
a
following
major role now.
Yeah, it's what you see in almost every Reach newsroom. There's I'm sure other newsrooms as well, but in Reach newsrooms, which I've been into recently, you know, there's a board showing what's getting the most hits, what's trending, and they follow that. That sets the agenda.
Yeah.
Which well, go on. I was going to ask one of my students something.
Yeah.
Go on. Where are you going, Patrick?
I'm about to start, but I've just been offered a job by the Sun, so it's quite an interesting time still. I've been doing freelancing at the Times, getting a couple of shifts a week. But really, I need full-time work, so I did a few trial shifts earlier this week to be a foreign reporter at the Sun. I was actually quite pleasantly surprised, to be honest. Right from the beginning, they were encouraging me to sort of work on off-diary stories and to think of my own long-term investigations.
Wow.
So yeah, I was quite pleasantly surprised. I think I'm going to take it up.
And you're not just churning it out.
No, not at all, no. Yeah. I mean, even the copy, it's not so sophisticated, but there's almost just as much thought that goes into it. So yeah, and the actual news gathering, I think, is just as scrupulous. I think the stories are just told in quite different ways.
Interesting.
That's encouraging that it's a writing role, and you're not simply looking to see what other people are doing and try to follow it.
Yeah, no, they have audience journalists, I think they call them, at the moment, which are very engaged with social media and will sort of tweak the SEO. But I'd say the bulk is still definitely sort of journalists.
Doing stuff as we would know. Yeah, how interesting. Thank you, Patrick. There's
I could just speak really loudly if you could hear me.
You can speak really loudly.
Perfect, amazing. I'm Katyayani. I'm a final year of BA Media and Communication student. I thank you so much for your talk, Patrick. I find it really interesting and I learned a lot from it. I was thinking about how you said that. I was thinking about how you said that tabloids were intended to be just short form written content. And I'm thinking about my own media practice now and how we are also adapting to social media and newer formats, and everything has to be short, more timely, more easy to consume. And I was thinking about, do you have any ideas or visions for how we can maintain journalism that is meaningful, thoughtful, informative, while keeping it short?
Yes, because it can be done. It's about I don't know, as Hamza said, it's about a concentrated form of how you do it. It's about effective use of language. It's about effective use of language. It's about making the most of the medium. Just because it's short and sharp and snappy doesn't mean that it's equally, it lacks content, it lacks meaning, it lacks seriousness. You can be short and snappy and serious as well. My voice is going.
Yeah, brevity is extremely important. It's a really valuable skill, and there are many journalists, senior, high-profile people who've had opportunities to write for both traditional broadsheet, in inverted commas, titles and tabloids, and they often say that it's harder to write for the tabloid because you need to be funny, you need to be sharp, you need to make every word count. It's a real discipline, but it's also a discipline that you should apply in longer formats as well. You should still value every word and not just be verbose and flabby in your writing. You should keep it concise, and I find it a useful thing in the column that I do for the iPaper, for example, that because it appears in print, I have an 800-word limit on it. If it was to appear only online, I would probably let it run further. That's the way things usually go, where you have other things to say. But it's a discipline to cut it back and to take out material that maybe, is struggling to deserve its place. And I think it makes the copy better for it.
And that is something that we very much, expect journalism students to understand, that, brevity is important. Even if it's brevity within a relatively long piece of journalism, it's the brevity of expression that concentrates the amounts of facts, so you can deliver more information in the shortest possible space, or in a defined space.
And you could probably apply that to other formats as well, like podcasting, which is obviously taking off phenomenally over the last few years. People don't necessarily have unlimited time, so don't just waffle on unnecessarily. Make your points succinctly.
Yeah, I think time is very important because we are all, time poor these days. And the idea of that, as I was talking about earlier, the leisured upper classes of the Victorian era, sitting down in front of the fire in the evening to read the long parliamentary and foreign reports in the Times and the Telegraph, it's a thing of the past now. We've got too many other competing things on our time, and that is just the way of the world, and we're in a swipe right, click through, scroll on culture. Yeah, John.
Very much on that point. I really liked Addison's book, Men on Men, which I'm looking forward to reading yours because it seems a longer duration and wider scope than that. When I think about the things that made Harmsworth's paper successful in the first place, having very small bits of news crammed onto a page, the thing that makes me think of now is Instagram Reels and TikTok. And I just wonder whether the press barons are just serfs toiling on the manners of the tech barons now.
Yeah, I think they're very vulnerable because the tap just gets turned off just like that. And I was saying earlier, how much the Sun and the Mail as well recently have suffered in the States with their traffic just having dropped, and they're really at the mercy of Meta and the other social platforms as to who sees their content. If people use Facebook these days, they're probably not really going to see any news on there. But I remember in the newsroom when that was seen as the future, that was going to save news. that's just become non-viable. And you turn on X now, you don't see news brands there. You see Elon Musk himself, whether you want to hear from him or not. And you see news influencers that you probably don't know. There's a report out this week from Pew in the States that looks at 2,000 American news influencers. They're proliferating like anything, and these are people that are not coming up through conventional news outlets. They're really operating off their own bat, and they're being promoted by the algorithm just as significantly, probably more than established news brands, whose output is generally being suppressed, I would say. So yeah, they're very vulnerable for that model, which is why so many news organisations are turning away from that and trying to get people to pay. But the tabloids are the most vulnerable in the sense that their content is not generally what people will pay for, and there's a sort of a sliding scale which starts with the FT and Wall Street Journal at the top, because it's business information that companies themselves will often pay the subscriptions for. Then the more high-end, better researched, generally, newspapers, or traditional newspaper brands that can charge. You get down into the more general interest output of the tabloids. They find it very difficult to charge. But even within that, you're now starting to see attempts to do that, at least to get people's data. You need to sign up and you need to accept cookies. Otherwise, they're going to try and throw a charge at you. So they're starting to move slightly in that paywall direction. And I mentioned that the Mail has managed to get those 100,000 people to pay for Mail Plus, which is the digital version of its newspaper. So they are trying to move a bit in that direction to bring in new revenue streams and not be so dependent on the traffic from socials.
I think if the tabloids can find ways to monetize in that way, which they've not been able to. I mean, the Sun did have a paywall briefly, and Rebecca Brooks, when she was put back in charge by Murdoch after Levinson, killed it immediately.
It lasted about 2 years in total. Yeah, she did.
Yeah.
I think they got about 200,000 in total, but, you know, as we were saying, they had 4 million paying readers of the print product at one point, so they lost that mass, and with that, they lost that power. You know, to just have 200,000 people paying. It wasn't the same thing, because people would think, why am I going to give an interview to you guys? You've only got 200,000. I can go to another outlet. I mean, suddenly The Guardian exploded in terms of its reach. But the other tabloids in the Mirror, for example, the traditional rival to the Sun, suddenly had a much bigger reach than the Sun did. And they thought, well, we can't go on like this, and pulled the paywall down.
Yeah, and no one's found another way of doing it. What's interesting is, I don't want to get too much in, as anyone, they haven't yet found a way of doing the kind of pay by story, have they, really? Which is
micropayments.
Micropayments, which, you know, 10 years ago people were talking about as possibly the saviour, the next big thing, but it doesn't seem to have happened, which is interesting. If someone can find a way of doing that and finding the right price point, that might be the saviour, not just for the tabloids, but just the way of the future.
The interesting thing is the relationship with the younger generations, who, you know, getting older now, but people have been prepared to pay for Netflix and Spotify. They haven't been prepared to pay for tabloid news, even if they consume it. And the newspaper industry put out some research last week saying that young people still read 6 stories a day from traditional news outlets. But I wonder, do they even know that they're reading them? You know, they might click on, they might read it, and then they'll move on to something else. And has that even left an impression on them that they were reading a piece of mail content or Mirror or whatever it might be, or was it just the story that stayed with them?
Yeah. I think that's very true. That isn't just young people. That applies to a lot of
Everyone
people.
now,
They're just picking things up off social media, and they don't know quite what the origin of it is. They might see some branding on it, but they might not. They're just interested in the story, and they read it and move on.
Yeah.
Which is sort of probably time for us to move on, unless there's any other questions. No? Okay. Who's outside? I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for turning up, and thanks to Ian for brilliant questioning. Thank you.